Kevin Young is one of the most talented and highly regarded poets in the United States today. He is prolific beyond measure as a writer, but I don't know where he finds the time. I'd like to spy on him and figure it out, because he also curates the single most important collection of 20th century poetry in English in this country, and probably anywhere, right, Kevin? Anywhere in the world. It's in Atlanta, where he is also the Charles Howard Candler Professor of Creative Writing in English. Kevin's the author of 11 books of poetry and prose. His most recent is a stunning collection, which is just out, Blue Laws, Selected and Uncollected Poems. And what's great, we were talking a little right before the event, so many of his books are thematic and focus on a particular subject area or have a very distinctive mood or tone. He's really unusual in this way. So it's really interesting to have a number of those different modes and tones all collected in one selected book. He also is the author of the Book of Hours, which was a finalist for the Kingsley Tufts Poetry Award and was the winner of the Academy of American Poets Lenore Marshall Prize. Another book that is really a great book is Ardency, which is a chronicle of the Amistad Rebels, as well as Dear Darkness. His collection, Jelly Roll, a Blues, was a finalist for both the National Book Award and the LA Times Book Prize. I personally highly recommend his nonfiction book. I mean, I love a number of these books of poetry. I love Jelly Roll. Blue Laws is amazing. I'm a big fan of Kevin's work, but I really highly recommend his nonfiction book, The Gray Album, on the Blackness of Blackness, which won the Graywolf Nonfiction Prize and the Penn Open Award. It's also a New York Times notable book and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. It's a book that, it's one of a number of very important books that are helping us I feel finally beginning to make a change in the culture that's needed to happen for a very long time. And I love the way he makes the case that Black culture is American culture. American culture is based on Black culture. It's an extraordinary book. He's also the editor of a number of collections, most recently the Collected Poems of Lucille. I know, it goes on and on and on. I can't help it if the guy does a lot. What can I say? The Collected Poems of Lucille Clifton. He's edited anthologies on, little anthologies on the blues and another one on jazz. He's done a great anthology on food called The Hungry Ear. Another one on poems of grief that you should give any person who you ever meet who has just lost a loved one. Just last week, Kevin was named to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Quite an honor. He's one of the most lauded poets in the country. Buy his collection, Blue Laws, or one of the other books from Open Books at Intermission. Thanks. Kevin.
Thanks, Tree. Thanks so much. That's such a sweet intro. And some of it even seemed true, actually. No, it's a real pleasure to be here back at Hugo House. I can eat the mic more if it needs to be up. Is it okay? I always love it here, and I'm glad to be in it's not quite the farewell tour yet, but I wish I was here to write on the walls and say how much I love being here in this space. Richard Hugo is one of my poets, especially for my first book, and I'm going to read a poem that you may get a little glimmer of some of his work later. Mostly I'm going to talk about voice today, and it's the talk I'm going to give is in two little parts, and I don't know if there's anything else you need to know about it. It does have an epigraph from Eric B. Well, actually from Rakim, sorry, the rapper. I hold the microphone like a grudge. Throw your voice. I never liked the term voice. It feels like a holdover, once useful to the workshop process of writing. helpful in some ways, but damaging in many others. Voice comes to us as a term to describe the writing process, as pervasive as write what you know, and has become as cliche. Here, by way of furthering notions of reading and writing, I want to talk about the question of voice, if only to speak against it, and then to change direction slightly, and to challenge the direction of contemporary poetry. I will suggest ways out of the dilemma voice raises by looking at other arts, including music and painting, as inspiration. First, usefulness. Voice is a way to encourage beginning writers to both look within themselves and in their own backyards to find something uniquely their own. Voice, in this sense, is often a stand-in for subject matter, a difficult thing for any writer to discover, or rather uncover, as it usually resides all around and within them. The mistake many writers make is to think that subject matter resides somewhere else, and for this, voice, with its inherent emphasis on something localized in the throat, remedies this. Another useful aspect of voice is that it focuses on the spoken qualities of the poem. That the poem, or any other writing really, is not something merely written, but something living, varied, and vibrant, lived. I heartily agree and think that in its spokenness, voice describes something of what modernists like William Carlos Williams and Langston Hughes thought the poem to be, but also made the poem into. In this sense, the voice may have the ring of the 1970s to it. It at least is part of a result of a modern view of the poem that became more and more dominant as the 20th century progressed. The danger here is manifold. In terms of younger writers, and I don't just mean younger in terms of age, but experience, the emphasis on voice has led to an obsession with style. This is what voice often translates into, less the evolution of particularity, but a cult of uniqueness. Too often I've seen writers who do not have any subject matter. This sounds meaner than I mean it. But instead possess a flair for form and, to their detriment, an unerring sense of style. Such style might best be called stylistic tics, a sort of shorthand for substance. And I'm going to talk about shorthand a little bit later. Not only does this confuse style, the way a poet writes, with substance, the reason a poet writes, pulling the red wheelbarrow before the horse, it also confuses style and form, two different things. What's more, in their search for uniqueness, these poets miss what's most unique, and the fact that people, poets included, don't always choose their subjects, or write about certain material because they want to, but because they must. Who wants to describe the hard feelings that life provides, the beauty and the bitterness, the blues? The goal of the poet is to find in these materials the stuff out of which to craft a poem. That is, a poem is not a style searching for material, but a record of the poet's struggle with the proper form to say what needs be said. I'm distinguishing here between style and form. One as a set of things associated with a poet, say Emily Dickinson's dashes. That even, shall we, in translation, or in Dickinson's case, her early editor's interventions. I love those early editions from the 1890s of Dickinson where they, sort of fix her language up a little bit and give titles. And in the second of those 3 volumes, which are very important, I mean, one can't over-stress how important those volumes are. You can see in the front, they've reprinted one of her manuscript pages, and it totally, to me, destabilizes the sort of cleaned up text after. It's really an interesting document, but that's the curator talking. So, sorry, the poet has to return to this essay. Anyway, so in translation, or in Dickinson's case, her early editor's interventions transcends. Style shifts, form is steady, even when it too is fractured, found, dissolving before our eyes. I'm making a case here, not for accessibility or obscurity, the two poles that contemporary poetry seems to be often arguing over, but necessity. poet's style may change, and of course, so too the forms they invent or find or use or abuse to say what they want. What doesn't change is what I want to discuss today. And voice is inadequate to the task. I shall, if time permits, provide a solution to the question of form and the problem of voice. My solving of the national debt is for another time. For now, it is enough to say that what style is to form, voice is to tone. After all, what we call voice should best be called voices. For it is my conviction that we are born with a voice, many in fact, and none need be found. Perhaps then the problem with voice is less with the term than with the directive to find your voice. I agree with William Stafford, who said, apparently in dissent at a writers' conference, after hearing a weekend's worth of talk about finding voice, that you need not find one because we all have a voice already. This caused no end of trouble, thankfully, and I think in many quarters, if you stood and said that today, you'd be greeted with just as many negative responses. And then I have a note to look around the room cautiously. One of the issues that I do not take lightly is that many have felt voiceless for some time. An emphasis on voice, like most views that become prominent, is a corrective to eons of what is often called silencing. Such silencing is a real process of disempowerment, of letting those who need the words, perhaps the most, believe they have little to say and even less worth listening to. Certainly, such silence faces the black writer when he or she sits down to face the blank page. Is what I'm writing about worth writing about? Is my experience worthy? Says who? When I started writing about my Louisiana family and the poems that would eventually make up my first book, I also started to realize that I hadn't seen many of the things that made up those poems in other people's books. I have spoken elsewhere of the early influence of Rita Dove's terrific Thomas and Beulah, the permission it gave me to write about my family, that my family and their way of speech was a worthy subject for a poem. But even with that example, I still hadn't seen many poems about slaughtering chickens or losing land you rightfully owned to the unscrupulous white man in town, or about my Uncle Sonnyman, or even a poem whose basic assumption was that the speaker, contemporary, was black, that the protagonist of the poem, driving the countryside, saw it from an inherently black perspective, one which recognized race and took it seriously, yet also saw it for the skin game that it was. So I thought I'd read one of the poems I'm sort of referring to. This is a poem from my very first book. So it's in Blue Laws, but I don't read it that often. It's, I wrote it when I was 19 or something. It's called Whatever You Want. It's about heat in Kansas, which is a real thing, and sort of the air conditioning go out. Whatever you want, for Arnold Kemp. This could be a good day. It starts without you, as usual. You haven't seen dawn in years. By noon, it hits half boiling, and the air breaks down. After lunch, even the fans turn lazy, not moving you or wind. Is it the Negro in you that gets in the car and just starts driving? Keeps the windows down, your music bouncing off station wagons, power windows, whatever you want to call it. It makes you feel you own everything, even the creeping heat. Spin the radio looking for summer, for love songs with someone somewhere worse off than you. Why doesn't anyone advertise for rain? Instead, the personalities keep talking to prove they are indoors, cool. By 7, the temperature outsails the price of gas. The movies are all sold out, and you can't get cool for the heavens. So, peel away. Head for the edge of town where the roads turn thin and alone, speeding to prove you can summon death, like tortoises cracked open in the road up ahead, the water stored in their shells, running free. Keep on trying to outrace heat's red siren until radio sings out, come home. Come on home, black boy, to your chimney full of birds, to this house of flame. Evening, the heat holds you with its aching, unavoidable fingers. You sleep naked, dreamless to heat. Windows thrown open as mouths, fan on. It still feels like a ghost is baking sweet potato pies through the night. Your favorite. Thanks. Since then, I came to more fully understand the work of Langston Hughes and others whose blues aesthetic implied blackness, and also the work of Seamus Heaney, luckily after I studied with him, so awe did not get in the way of his mostly subtle advice, who considers not only the blood and basics of country life, but who also wrote of Irishness as a given in a way that was not so much freeing as reaffirming. He is never translating into another language besides his own. His tongue is ungoverned. But before coming across some such examples and many others, like most poets, I went it alone. We often find our crucial literary ancestors after we've tried or started to find a form for what we need to say. Why then would voice not be enough for such discovery? Because the voice I found in my first book wasn't just my own, or even singular, but rather that of my grandparents and parents, of fictional slave owners and imagined ancestors, of carnival barkers and guides to colored zoos. And what's more, in a crucial early poem called Visiting Home, I found the multitude of voices that made up not just my family, but the way my family told stories in bits and pieces, fragments created by time, and memory and pain, that I sought in that poem and in the book more generally to arrange to tell some sort of story. The poems are in different voices or persona, often back to back. The narrative, too, is not plot but story. It's not forward but sidelong and catty corner, as jerry-built and sturdy as my grandparents' houses. In fact, one of the imagined voices in the poem was of my late cousin Keith, as if he'd lived, or rather, of his ghostly voice telling our story. In a way, I thought of my first book as a ghost story, one not told by me, but by those plural ancestral voices who spoke through me. I was not, as the victims of voice urge us, speaking for them. They spoke for me and through me, and I was merely standing in their stead and debt. Such voicings have less to do with speech than with speaking in tongues, something I've seen a few kinfolk do in the throes of the Holy Ghost. For one of the limits of voice is its emphasis on naturalness, when you need not be a theorist or a language poet to note the ways in which speech can be artificial or moves beyond the bounds of the natural speaking voice. But we need not speak in tongues to see this. We need only sing. This is not the place to reify song as the true domain of poetry. I'll try to save that for the poems themselves. But it need be said that while voice may imply song, too often it does not. Instead, voice has come to me not just style and subject matter, but also story in the most limited sense as autobiography. Voice is seen as personal and natural, and not as varied, virtuosic, and choral as song implies. Song, too, gives us a nice sense of the artificialness necessary for a poem, while song is ancient and usually human, not to speak of birdsong. It is also constructed, acculturated, and to my mind, accented. This is to say, song shows its trace of its history, but seeks to go beyond it. Transcendent, yet temporal, song exists in the here and now. And until our recording era, song also disappeared after sung. The poem is the song made permanent. I thought I'd read a song. Is that what you do with a song, read? This is Dream Song 14 by John Raymond. Life, friends, is boring. We must not say so. After all, the sky flashes, the great sea yearns, we ourselves flash and yearn. And moreover, my mother told me as a boy, repeatingly, ever to confess you're bored means you have no inner resources. I conclude now I have no inner resources because I am heavy bored. Peoples bore me. Literature bores me, especially great literature. Henry bores me with his plights and gripes as bad as Achilles, who loves people and valiant art, which bores me. And the tranquil hills and gin look like a drag, and somehow a dog has taken itself and its tail considerably away into mountains or sea or sky, leaving behind me, wag. And I think this poem proves this next thing I'm going to say, or that poem I should say. A better term even than song to describe the writing process to a starting writer is tone. And I think you see that in the dream songs throughout, but especially even in that poem where you hear many voices. The dream songs are, of course, rife with them. People speaking as I, people speaking as we, people speaking as you, they even sometimes. And that kind of panoply of voices, I think, really comes down to these different shifts in tone. It is tone that is hardest to achieve. Among many distinctions, tone is the one thing that great writers share as a mark of their uniqueness and their achievement. By that I mean that each writer creates a tone all his or her own. If what is meant by voice is something closer to tone, then I can get behind it. If by tone we mean something close to the muted beauty of Miles Davis's horn, then I support it wholeheartedly. Davis's tone, unmistakable even from a few notes, is unique, the product of his breath and body, a quality of mind and emotion or suppression of that emotion, that is to say, cool, meeting the form of music. When Miles plays a standard, it is transformed, his own. When he reaches for his own compositions, they take on his tone almost before his horn enters the recording. There's a great record I love, sort of one of his early fusion records called Jack Johnson, which is, of course, about the first black heavyweight, the great boxer and figure, who Jean-Michel Basquiat painted, and I ended up writing a long poem about. But if you read or listen to the album, it's just two songs, one on each side of the LP. And the first cut, it's just like a guitar riff for 10 minutes, which is better than that sounds. And it's just sort of setting up this sound, but it's still a Miles Davis. You can tell it's Miles Davis just from that. And I think of that a lot, about how do you, in something wordless and you're not even in it, it's still all yours. Anyway, such qualities of tone, which I take in its jazz sense, are those to which we should aspire, finding not our voice but our breath, not our style but our own particular phrasing, not our own perspective or story but our own music. By music, I mean that tongue beyond our own, but also our own. I also mean something quite specific, related to some of the questions raised by my other former teacher, Denise Levertov, and the Black Mountain School of Poets she's associated with. Her emphasis was always on the notion of the poem as a score, and the line breaks as crucial to the notes the poet intends the reader, in this sense, the composer, to hear. She was known to stop cold anyone in workshop mid-reading if she felt the author was not conforming to her or his own line breaks. It was pretty intense for her to be like, "What are you doing?" "It is not that. The page is a score," she'd say. The poem then is not just a transcription, though it is that, but also a directive to the reader. The line break becomes, in free verse, not less important, but more. Indeed, as Levertov emphasized in her writings, it is the only tool, line breaks, that we have to indicate the poem's music. after the rote formalism that plagues any age, how freeing such a notion was. That the poem wasn't just a monument, but a living thing, proof not of truth, but of breath. And what could be truer than that? Let's see where we're at here. Such realizations and Levertov's instructions became my assumptions, and that way influenced the sounds of what I was trying to say. There's a music in the mind, quite different even from the breath. And getting that music down is the hard part and the point. Breath, too, can become a limiting standard. It, too, thinks of the poem as all natural, its form not so much organic, as Levertov beautifully described. That's such a great essay about unorganic form, but as all natural as high fructose corn syrup. In this way, breath can become regularized, homogenized, too. I'm going to skip a little bit. Tone better describes our many variations, both in the voices we carry in our heads and those we use daily, whether in intimate arguments and sweetnesses with lovers, or those we use at work or with family or faith or forgoing all else. Tone implies intimacy, not just with subject, but with the reader. Readers may make this tone their own or interpret it their own way, but they must recognize it in some way when they're being that composer. Tone demands not just listeners, but readers. It requires activity for both poet and reader, where voice can imply passivity. And instead, tone requires both music and attitude. I'm reminded of what my high school teacher used to drill into our little brains, that tone is an author's attitude to his work. A good working definition as any. And with her, a writer was always a he. Such attitude I now see less as emotional tone than as musical. It's not merely a stance, but an embouchure, a way of making the mouth so it makes more than speech. Tone, then, is the unstealable, inescapable, and occasionally translatable quality of a poet. This does not mean that tone doesn't change. Instead, one of tone's most cogent qualities is its variety, the way it can shift gears. Tone does not, unlike voice, worry about being consistent. I think of Berryman here and all his changes, or Merwin, or Baraka, or Adrian Rich, poets who changed a lot, certainly in their style and even in their subject matter, but they all maintained that tone, I would argue. Tone does not worry about being consistent. Once achieved, it can and must be played with, but like mercury. It is both fluid and solid, dangerous, and how we may best measure the temperature of what's going on around us. How's everyone doing? Okay. So the second little part is called Fight Your Hand. Excuse me. Fight your hand. Rather than insisting on finding your voice, I'm here to tell you to fight your own hand. In this, I'm borrowing from the visual arts, where hand is both a signature, a unique style, something like tone in music, or as I've suggested in writing, and also a stand-in for draftsmanship or drawing talent. Like having a good voice, it is not always necessary, or perhaps even preferable. It can even be preferable not to have a good hand to be a good artist. Just as someone's voice can be said to be too good. I had some examples of what I think is someone with too good of a voice, but I won't say them. We recognize the ways in which simple technical mastery can leave one cold. Take Eric Clapton, please. Getting gut bucket, grimy, real, is a way of recognizing that sometimes roughness, ugly beauty, to use Thelonious Monk's phrase, is far preferable. Monk the musician is a good example here. His flat fingers, against all sense of European classical music propriety, turns the keyboard back into a percussive instrument rather than a stringed one, and turns it into an African-American instrument, which is to say a cornerstone of American classical music. What Monk did is fight his hand, battling against the draftsmanship that he surely could have exhibited, his own technique resisting technique. It is not a failure, this, but a measure of the distance between hand and brain, between propriety and motion. There is, of course, a long tradition of blurring and blue notes, from ragtime to blues to stride piano and boogie-woogie, for us to rely on as examples of this. Now, in the visual arts, there are two ways of fighting one's hand that I'm interested in stealing for writing. One, by restricting your hand, usually by making that hand artificial or removing it altogether. The other is by freeing it, ignoring its rules or limits or even traditions and substituting one's own. These two are related, of course, differing mainly in vector. One insists on more rules, binding the hand in order to focus on either the mind or the binding or both. Take Warhol. His use of silk screens was to fight his quite delicate, beautiful drawing hand. This is the time when I wish I had a visual for you. If you haven't seen his early drawings, they're quite lovely. And he did a lot of early commercial work. And if you look at it, you can see the way he could render a beautiful line, and even an unusual line, but not quite special. If he had stuck with it, we wouldn't likely be speaking about him or arguing about his achievement, which I myself take to be great. To fight that hand, even in his early pop paintings, he traced from projections or copied things exactly by hand as he did in his first Campbell soup cans. Those weren't actually silkscreen, they were hand-drawn. Then he turned to silkscreening, which of course removed his hand but left his eye. A large part of his art is in his selection of subject, which for nearly all of the 1960s remained brilliant and spot on, moving from the disasters to flowers, from Jackie diptychs to even Mao wallpaper, and that was later in '73, mirroring, mocking, and predicting generation to come. The fact that several of these subjects were suggested to him makes this fighting his hand all the more formal. I mean, sort of the charge against Warhol is that like he, empirically stole other people's ideas, but he was pretty honest that he was going to steal your idea, I think. And I would argue that's a large part of what he's trying to do in this fighting his hand. Warhol, of course, developed a persona to accompany this hand. His expressed desire to be a machine was both personal and playful, a way of making his art the subject and removing not just his hand but his self from the process. Far more emblematic of him than a soup can is the telephone or his wig, artificial, removed, and somehow right. Such remove isn't for everyone, either as a maker or lover of art. Sometimes what we want is the mess, is the hand itself. You would think that abstract expressionism, whose very name, however inexact some would feel it is, describes the presence of hand perfectly, might be where one should look for the dirty dirt. Certainly for a generation or more, Abex painters exemplify the ways in which you must find your hand, however restrained. Its mix of freedom and fighting against, perhaps best embodied by the long apprenticeship and later long career of William de Kooning. De Kooning's willingness to revive and destroy, to be the best painter of his generation, but not to show his work, or rather to become the best painter because he didn't show his work, becomes only more heroic the more you delve into it. I don't know if anyone's read the de Kooning biography that won the Pulitzer a number of years ago, maybe 8-10 years ago, but it's a tremendous book, and he invented so many things, including, they think, like the studio platform bed. He invented that, But one of my favorite sort of de Kooning stories is Robert Rauschenberg, the generation below him, who went to de Kooning's house to request a drawing to erase. And the hand you fight isn't always your own, but that feeds you. What I think is funny about that is he paced around his door for a while, then finally gets up the courage and says, can I get a drawing of yours to erase? And de Kooning sort of gets it, and he takes them, so just give me any drawing. He says, no, it has to be a very good one. And so he gave him a drawing, and I think it took like 6 months and 3 erasers or something to give this, it was so intense of a drawing. More to my point, And to the second way of fighting your hand is to look at, is to look at one of the best painters of what gets called the neo-expressionist moment of the 80s, Jean-Michel Basquiat. The thing we must or should keep in mind when viewing his work are the many ways he fought his natural talent, even as he expressed it. And I'm not talking about drugs, which to some bad fools made him paint better, but clearly destroyed him. Rather, Basquiat freed his hand by fighting it. If we consider his early comic book type art, he did these kind of bubbly figures. We can see the ways in which his early style was exactly that, a style. Though his early work displayed a humor similar to his mature work, it didn't manage the grandness or theme or the daring of the technique he found later. He found this when he was around 20. So when I say later, I don't mean much later, and unfortunately he was dead by 27. For this, Basquiat would borrow in part the language of abstraction, married both to his own subject matter, which he once called royalty heroism in the streets, and his own style, which used symbols from crowns to halos, from crashing cars a la Warhol, to exposed rib cages, to provide an art both beautiful and tragic. The result was an iconography all his own. His mark was personal, creating his own myth. When he was a kid, he was hit by a car playing, and he was in the hospital, and he received Gray's Anatomy as a gift from his mother. Which just to see sort of what was happening. He lost his spleen, spleen, which I think is just an amazing gift, especially for an artist. So by crafting a set of symbols that were neither obscure nor obvious, but suddenly ever present, he sort of achieved this hand. In other words, his technique was gnomic. It was as much about doing as knowing. With a willingness, his seemingly messy style seemed to say, to undo. His work was layered, and while he used copies, he had apparently in his studio an early and thus very expensive color copier. So he'd copy his own drawings and then collage himself over and over again. I also think of this as kind of sampling himself or looping. In this, Basquiat both exhibited and extended the hip-hop aesthetic. Rather than merely sample something or someone else, he was self-referential in his technique and inclusive in its effect. We feel ourselves drawn into his world, his set of associations in shorthand, something difficult to achieve and that I wouldn't always suggest a poet can follow. Shorthand, after all, see, I told you I would mention shorthand, is a language that always sits alongside another, a set of symbols referring to words, but not the words themselves. It is always communicative, is not always communicative, and its worst is only that. I sometimes see, and I wish I could describe when I see it, but sometimes younger writers use this kind of shorthand. They don't take us through that process. They don't enact something in the poem. They just kind of refer to it. And I think that's really important and kind of dangerous. You can't sort of dare us to decode these things for us. You have to create your own symbols and imbue them with meaning, and that's sort of something I'm trying to suggest that Basquiat did. We must remember the difference between code and myth. One may become less interesting when uncovered. The other is more or less discovered and continually. So I think of codes as this thing that once you crack it, it might not be as interesting. But this myth, like the myth Basquiat has of the Gray's Anatomy, which, I don't mean by myth something untrue, I mean something deeply true, is powerful. His crown, one of his famous symbols, is both earned and ironic, both a recognition of royalty and the fact that, quote, most young kings get their head cut off. The crown, I'm almost done, I promise. The crown wears heavy on the head, after all. All this is to say that rather than merely being artificial in his fighting of hand, Basquiat went for freedom of the outsider, of crown maker and heavyweight fighter, of faux naif and art brute. The hand he fought was his own and history's. He's transcribed lists from textbooks, both to include history and to mock and mark its accumulation, to show how fluid and unremembered it could be, and to cement his place in it. So I'm going to read a quick poem, then I'm going to end. This is a poem from my second book, and it was the first poem in the first double album I did of called To Repel Ghosts, and it's sort of second in the remix. It's called Campbell's Black Bean Soup. Candid, Warhol scoffed, coined it a nigger's loft. Not the factory, Basquiat's studio stood anything but lofty. Skid rows of canvases, paint peeling like bananas, scabs. Bartering work for horse, Basquiat churned out butter, signing each same-o, same old, Sambo's soup. How to sell out something bankrupt already. How to copy rights. Basquiat stripped labels, opened and ate alphabets, chicken and noodle. Not even brown broth left beneath, not one black bean. He smacked the very bottom, scraping the uncanny, making a tin thing sing. So, and I'll end with this just sentence or two. Basquiat would hold the pencil or art stick awkwardly. He kind of held it like this, almost purposely, not between index finger and thumb, but almost threaded through his fingers. He painted with his fists. Thanks very much.
I just want to, well, my name is Jane Wong. Just so you know, I'm just not just a floating presence. Well, I kind of am. But I just want to give another round of applause for Kevin's talk. It was incredible. Thank you so much, Kevin. Oh, wait. Oh.
I was remiss. I was supposed to pop back up when you came back and introduce Jane Wong, who is a fantastic poet here. And her poems can be found in a number of anthologies and journals, such as Best American Poetry 2015, which was really great to have someone from Seattle. Best New Poets 2012, Pleiades, Third Coast, and others. She's a recipient of scholarships and fellowships from the Fulbright program, the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, Squaw Valley, Breadloaf. She teaches poetry and Asian American Studies at the University of Washington, Bothell, and also, I'm happy to say, at Hugo House. And she has her first full-length collection coming out from Action Books, great publisher, in the fall. It's called Overpour. And she also has 3 chapbooks that are already out. I'm so sorry. Jane.
Thanks. That was kind of like Tree serenading me over on the side. Thank you. And thank you again for your talk. I have so many questions to ask, but I'm just going to freeform this and just randomly point at one occasionally in my own kind of true tone, I would say. And I'll start with this one.
Okay.
So I'm going to work a little backwards.
Okay.
So one of the things that you were mentioning in your talk, which I loved, and again, the distinction between voice and tone, which I feel is really key. It strikes me that one's unique tone that's always there in the work, regardless of kind of different forms or kind of revolutions of kind of reading and kind of writing, and this idea of the unique code too. I get a sense that that could also possibly be a response to a prescribed form or connotation, and there seems to me potentially that one's unique tone could be a form of resistance, potentially. I was curious as to what you thought about that. So tone maybe seems very natural, but can it also be something that is a matter of resistance, like pushing against something else?
Sure. I mean, I could just answer it, yes, you're correct. Yeah, I mean, I want tone to be, and I think it is, much more flexible. For me, it can be artificial, you know. I think of Berryman again, where there's poems. It's not like the dream songs aren't a natural feeling form, at least to me. I mean, I think they became natural for Berryman over the course of his writing them. After all, he starts with 77 and then writes, like 309 more. It just got addictive, I think. But at the same time, they're purposefully sometimes quite strange, and you don't know who's talking, and like the sort of code, if you will, of them is sometimes hard to crack. And once you do crack it, though, I don't know do they become less mysterious? I don't think so. I think they maintain that mystery. And there's kind of a resistance to our notion of knowledge or clear understanding, because they're sort of about confusion. And Langston Hughes, to me, I think of his late poem, Ask Your Mama, one of the best titles ever for a long American poem. And that poem is really great. It has, if you've never seen it, it's almost shaped like this in the original. It's like sideways. And it has this kind of salmon-colored paper in the first edition with blue type. And in the margins are like directions of how to read the poem and sort of notes, but they're also riffing on it. And then, the poem itself is very much sort of talking back to itself and to other people, and the tone of it is very, I wish I could describe it. It would take an essay, but it's kind of, in fact, I had tried to write one for the Gray album, I never could. But it's sort of wry, but knowing, and then every once in a while it's like, I don't know, ask your mama, like just tossed in there. So the short version is, yes, tone, I think, can be subversive.
I really like that answer, especially being subversive to one's own kind of like impulses.
Well, I think you have to be.
Yeah, right.
I think that's the problem, I think, with voice. It's like, well, I have my voice, and I have to maintain it. Mm-hmm. And, maybe you have to betray it or fight your hand. That's what I was trying to get us to think about.
That's great. Thank you. I'm also thinking a lot about these kind of idioms or sayings that you mentioned. The absolutely horrible, mysterious one, find your voice. There's another one that I can't understand, which is like, I need a little help with flow. Like, what? What flow?
People say that?
Oh, yeah. Believe it or not. But one of the ones that kind of stuck with me, and I'm curious what you think about this in relation to Find Your Voice, is what do you make of learn by imitation? I think that's one that's often thrown around in the workshop, too. And when I was a beginning writer, I would constantly have to kind of imitate these poets. We read this poem by Emily Dickinson today. Like, write a poem inspired by Emily Dickinson.
Sure.
And we tended to just imitate her. I was curious about what you thought about that idiom, too, and what that does to one's voice, or rather tone.
That's a great question. I think it's a oddly bigger question, because I do think imitating when you're starting out is both helpful and sort of inevitable, even if you don't say, oh, I'm going to sit down and imitate. The history of poetry is filled with first books and false starts that are, derivative isn't the right word, but it comes to mind. At the same time, I think there's something really that can teach you a lot from other writers, of course. I don't know. It's hard. I think the workshop, part of it is how do you stay in it for weekly. There's a real, I used to give my students like 1 week off. They can like tap out and say like, it just didn't happen this week. And then I was like, no, they have to still. So, is that mean? Or I felt like that was the point of the workshop, is actually to push you into this almost artificial productivity. I think the key, they should have like after workshop support systems, because I think that's the tough part. And I remember, just from my own writing, I came to school as a freshman, and it was also Lucy Brock-Broido's first year, and I took her all my first year, which was pretty unusual. Freshmen didn't often take writing classes. My good friend Colson Whitehead, arguably the best novelist of his generation, our generation, couldn't get in any workshops, you know. So it was kind of a strange system. So I felt fortunate to get in. I took her all my freshman year, and then I remember vividly thinking, I'm going to take a semester off from workshopping. And it, like, what? You know, like, did I know how to write? Period. You know, like, forgetting write well or anything. Don't think I knew, and that was really instructive to me. And then I was fortunate enough to have like a Stegner and figured out like what my natural rhythm was. And this is not about what you asked, but I think it's important to figuring out your own tone. You know, you have to have time beyond imitation, because I don't know. I think in a weird way, what you're asking is, should you do that in workshop? In a way, you have no choice, but in a way, there's a certain point after that where you have to stumble around and fail a bit spectacularly and find your own tone.
I like that. I'm getting the sense that the concept of, imitation isn't necessarily, I mean, it could be negative in the sense of literally copying someone's kind of style or tone, but it could be a matter of rather kind of understanding that you might be part of a larger dialogue of poets you admire and are in the same, I am so sorry about continuing the analogy, but like within the same range of your tone of sorts, if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, I think of that Rauschenberg erasure of William de Kooning. What a crazy, great, brilliant thing that is, you know, to say, like, my art is erasing your art. But I think the key is that I've seen people now, they're doing erasures, but they're of, like, their peers, which I think is really creepy. I mean, you know, it's fine to be like, you're the king of the hill, I'm going to come after you in a kind of intimate way. And he asked his permission, you know. I thought that's an important part of that process. It's kind of saying the baton is now mine. How do I create a blank canvas for something else to happen? And if you've ever seen that erased de Kooning drawing, it still has kind of a drawing-like quality. You can tell it's an absence, thinking of when we were talking about ghost stories just a moment ago.
Great. Kind of maybe related to ghosts, but also thinking a little bit about, I guess, poets who, or artists that you're able to kind of connect to, have it be through erasure, but also in terms of community. And I know that you've worked very closely with Lucille Clifton's work. And this is a totally selfish question because this poem, Mercy, has been like, won't leave me for for years and years and years, and it's going to lead to a question. But I'm just going to read a little bit from this passage that kind of haunts me. This is from Clifton, and she writes, "But whenever I begin, the trees are their knotted branches, and why is there under that poem always other poem?" And I wanted to ask a little bit about what Lucille Clifton's kind of saying, that there's some other poem underneath the poem that you're actually writing. And I think that comes back to this idea of voices you were talking about earlier.
Well, she has a book literally called Voices.
Yeah.
You know, I think that poem is important because it's a little like in the 60s, Nikki Giovanni has a poem, and I'm going to mangle it a little bit, where she talks about like, I could write a poem about trees, but I can't, right? And I think Clifton is sort of saying in that moment, there is this thing I could write about, but why is there something beyond that? And it's not just subject matter, I don't think. She's not saying that. I think she's saying that you have to listen for this other undertone, let's call it. And you see that in her work. She's really able to get at those unspoken moments, celebration of the unspoken, of the unsaid. Perhaps her most famous poem, Won't You Celebrate With Me? And sort of the end of that poem where she's a little like Merwin, for the anniversary of my death, like celebrating something that hasn't happened. that every day something's tried to kill me and failed. It's a beautiful poem. And I think that she's really pushing us to think about what poetry can do. And, her famous quote, she might have been quoting someone else, is like, she wants to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, And I think that she's really, that's how she views poetry, and that poem is part of that.
That's fantastic. Kind of like having to make something happen. It seems like something has to happen.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question, because it goes back to your question about resistance.
Yeah.
As soon as you start to say, well, now poems have to be about this, I get nervous. I think you can say, like, poems are better when they do X and Y, but it's hard to say, no, well, this is what a poem is only. Because what I'm trying to talk about and understand, at least in my talk, is a way that poems work and work best, and try to save us a little time sometimes and cut through some of the rhetoric that's built up around, say, voice or innovation, what makes innovation. Because Lucille Clifton's incredibly innovative. And if we see innovation as only one way, then we miss out on a deeper kind of innovation, which is one of tone, too. And I think maybe that's what I would say that poem is about. Like, you gotta find your own poem under the poem, and don't settle for what you're supposed to write about. I think that's partially what she's saying.
Yeah, like a kind of deep listening, potentially, then.
Let's hope so.
Yeah, wow. One question I'm very curious about, and this is kind of a personal one for me too. You were mentioning during your talk about, the kind of real process of disempowerment and kind of like silenced voices. And you were talking specifically about family and kind of like growing up. I remember when I spent my time at Iowa, I never wrote about my family, and I never wrote about, kind of like those voices, because I felt like it wasn't, I don't know, like I shouldn't. Like I felt like I should be reading someone smarter or something of that sort. And I wanted to ask you a question about, I mean, there's that potentially, as you mentioned, there's a desire to kind of like, to write kind of through that, not about, but what is that like on a kind of like visceral level? And two, and this is the question I'm always curious about, but like, how does your family respond, or how do these voices kind of speak back? At least in my case, my mom saw me read for the very first time just this past year, and she asked
How'd that
me.
go?
I made her actually stand in front of an entire crowd at the new school and had everyone clap for her, so she was very confused. But she said, and again, it was kind of a poem, kind of like about her, or there's some poems about her, and she kind of like responds with, "Did that happen?" As if it was true, like I made it up. A lot of it is imagination.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, so I'm curious.
So
like,
you buried the lead on that.
Yeah, kind of.
Like, I made it up, so she. I mean, I think that. Are you asking about like sort of conjuring things up, or what are you asking?
Yes. Okay. On one hand, like, yes. What do you make up, conjure, and how does your family respond to your work about them? Right? If they don't. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's the latter question first. I think they sometimes respond. I mean, in general, they've been very positive. So I think when I first read From Most Way Home, my uncle said, "Well, Kevin just remembered all the lies we told and wrote them down," which is true. And in black culture, lies, means mostly folk tales. So I love that. That to me was a great compliment. I think there's another way in which you can become the family historian. Mm-hmm. It's almost one of the roles being asked, especially in families that aren't necessarily recorded. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important. I remember there's a poem that I didn't put in Blue Laws about my father sort of in the Civil Rights March and SNCC and sort of 60s. And I remember him telling this story, and I pretty much just wrote it down later. It has some poetry in it, but it already had some in it when he told it. And I gave it to him, and he said, oh, you remembered that. And then I remember him, the way he said it made me think, like, he told me knowing that I would do that. And he was with his other a friend like his age, and they were both telling these kind of stories about the 60s, which they were reticent, and I sort of mentioned that in the piece, like that there's a way in which the stories never come. You know, then I decided to go to college, and I went here, and then I, you know, was in the civil rights. You know, it's just like one day you're like, yeah, that's when we owned that. You're like, what are you talking about? Many directions I really wanted to capture in this book, but also I think there's a secret way that they, you know, that's one of poetry's roles, is to record sort of the tribe's doings, but also the tribe's dreams. And so that conjure is important. There was a first part of your question, though, too. Did I answer?
Let's forget it. I've already forgotten it in my own kind of reverie of sorts. I don't know, Tree, should we move it to Q&A from everyone else? Or
Yeah, sure.
I could do that. So maybe a couple of questions from the audience out there.
Yeah, in the front.
Ooh.
Wow.
I wrote that word down, but then I crossed it out, actually. No joke.
That's what I would do with it. I think it's overdetermined, I suppose. I feel like it's that's sort of my best answer. I mean, the Gray album, which Tree mentioned, thanks for mentioning Tree, is sort of about like lying and about the ways that lies, especially folk tales, become part of what I call storying. Because when in Louisiana, where my family's from, you couldn't say to someone, certainly not a grown-up, and even to your cousin, you couldn't say like, "You lie." You'd say, "You story," And so I wanted to think about that and kind of honor that, but then also think about the ways that like a Louis Armstrong solo, wordless though it is, tells a story, and that's what people say Armstrong did for jazz. They are right, these people. So how do you think about story as this kind of improvisational thing that, to me, is directly against authenticity as a kind of bellwether, Like, I think this a lot, and it starts the book in slavery, where, are you trying to be authentic, or are you just trying to get out of there, So you have people forging free pass, like learning to read, forge a free pass, or I'm going to pass as your owner because I'm light-skinned, and we're gonna travel north, and I'm gonna pretend you're my slave, and we're gonna get out of here. All this is the opposite of authenticity in our sort of narrow notion of it. And in fact, authenticity allows that to happen because we believe what we see is what we believe. And so I think a lot about it, but I don't think much of it, if you know what I mean. And so my next book is kind of about liars writ large. Someone's in Tin House about plagiarism, and there was a part about hoax memoirs, fake memoirs. And so I'm really interested in that and as a kind of direction and way of thinking outside the box of authenticity. It's a great question, though.
Great question. Another question from the audience? Yes.
That's a good question. I mean, I think you always have to try to, make it new. For me, I think you have to think about your habits. So these aren't quite the same as tone, but how do you break your habits? If you always have X kind of ending, how do you, and sometimes it's a good ending, but how do you find the true ending? I mean, that is tough. I think restlessness helps. I get a little bit sick of it. Having a good reader or two who can call you on, like you always use Gray in that moment, or sometimes you got a lot of gerunds going on. Let's get to it. So, and I think noticing patterns and then creating rules, it's a little like fighting your hand, what I was talking about.
Yeah.
Creating some arbitrary rules can help you a lot. A case in point, for my second book, To Repel Ghosts, I decided pretty early on and just instinctively I wouldn't have I in the book, like, I as self. I certainly wouldn't have myself, but I also wouldn't have Basquiat speaking. So the only times there's really an I is when there's a quote or someone else, persona, which is only the Jack Johnson poems, speaking. And that was really helpful to only have the person speaking be not me and be a persona. And it was this limit. I could say we, I could say you, I could say a lot of things, but I couldn't say I really miss you, Jean-Michel, who I didn't know. And part of it was because of that, because I didn't know him. It helped maintain this distance. Now, I don't think anyone who read the book sat there and said, there's no I in here. But it was really a useful limit for me, and sometimes the best limits are ones no one's going to notice. And even Oulipo, the famous movement with restricted language and things like that, I think it's key to remember that the famous book that has no E in it, that was purposefully not announced. It's not like he said, by the way, I did this thing. And he wanted no one to notice or see if anyone noticed, and no one did. And it partially was thinking about, serious matters like the Holocaust. How can you disappear a whole letter and no one notice? And so these limits, while they're aesthetic, are also kind of ethical and moral, I would say.
Thank you. One other question out there? Yes.
I've thought about it. It's hard, memoir, as I like to call it.
Fancy.
Yeah. I think it's very hard. Some of my good friends are writing them now. I think Tracy K. Smith has one, and Elizabeth Alexander's is also tremendous. And I think you have to have a very specific something to say. Otherwise, you can drift into me territory, if you know what I mean. So I think there will be a time when I write more personal essay. In fact, what's strange is, like, even in this new book, I want to kind of sneak in little anecdotal things, and it's like my editors are just like, get that out of there, which I appreciate, because I do think sometimes we think that's the only form, and I think the essay, if you're talking about what you love, even if there isn't an I, say, you figure out a lot about a person from that. I hope that even in something like the Gray album, which it does in some parts, like the Bob Kaufman chapter is very personal, I feel. It's a sort of sideways autobiography.
I'm just curious now to follow up that question. Can you give us an anecdote that was crossed out? What did your editor cross out? What is the?
You're too good. I don't like it. I'm trying to think. I mean, some of it may make its way back into this new book, and because it's new, it's hard for me to remember or want to say. I don't know. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this, like what you don't say. Because in the original To Repel Ghosts, there were all these things crossed out, because Basquiat crossed out things, and he said because it makes you want to read them more. And so I had like, I don't know, a number of poems, and the poems were all numbered. Excuse me. And but I had some that I couldn't finish or wouldn't write, and I just had them crossed out in the table of contents. And sometimes some of them came later, but I was always obsessed with this kind of crossing out what's not there but there. I don't know, those stuff, it'll come there. But I've had like a intense experience with a like not quite famous liar, but almost famous liar, and I don't know if that'll end up making it into the book.
Is it Kanye?
No.
Okay.
He's famous. I don't know if he's famous for lying, but he's famous.
I'm thinking a lot about actually anecdotes in particular, and I don't know, I'm really struck by kind of like how they're always crossed out, kind of like the personal is taken out to get too personal. And why do you think that is? It's funny, I'm thinking about kind of the idea of voice being like your own, but yet there's such a push. I mean, there's a reason I think when I was in Iowa to like not write about my family. There was like a sense that I should not do this. Why do you think there's this kind of let's not get personal, like a pushback of sorts?
It's tough to know why, though I have suspicions. I mean, I think that sometimes how would I put it? I think sometimes the ball keeps shifting. It's like confessional, everyone confessed, and then here you come and you want to tell your story. It's like, well, actually, we're not interested in stories anymore. But it's right when, like people of color are starting to tell their stories more, or, and so there is a kind of level of strange denial there. That said, I think thinking about just tones, how do you tell that story new? How do you make it your own? I think that's much more the question than whether you should or shouldn't. As I was trying to suggest, you don't have a choice of subject matter. You have to write about what you have to write about. And a lot of that is who made you and who you are, one is. And, I think it's important to honor that. A book like Nick Flynn's Some Ether, I think, is a great example of how do you write a book about this thing you have to write about and make it your own and not just like a story, but poems. So I think he's someone who really did this powerful work. And then also wrote a great memoir about the same but different, how do you do that? And I love his sort of journey in nonfiction as well. Poets make the best nonfiction writers, but don't tell anyone that.
I think the secret's out now. I think we're at the end, potentially.
Unless someone has one burning last question.
Burning last question?
Okay,
Oh.
kind of burning.
Kindling.
Sure. That is kind of burning, right?
Whoa.
I don't know. That's a great question. I'd almost sort of, just riffing off sort of what we were talking about here today, I mean, I'd almost ask someone to like write the I poem and then write like the you, like turn it on its head somehow, right? Either like the poem not at all an I, or maybe the we that came out, or maybe just the you. Like there's something powerful about like talking back to oneself in one's own poem. And sometimes I can't tell all my tricks because I have workshop tomorrow. I'm going to show some of these tricks, but some of that are things I do in workshop. Some techniques to kind of get you out of that. But I think there's a way starting writers, and I see it more with sometimes my students, where they'll have a whole poem that's about something else, and then suddenly there's an I at the end. And it's almost as if, like, it's not a poem unless I weigh in, and it's a little like when we were sitting around, my wife said something, and then my son was like, well, that's your opinion. And I'm like, it's always someone's opinion. You don't have to say, my opinion is the thing that I'm saying. So, long story short, I think thinking about how do you get your I in, but also how do you get your I out of your poem? And are you just tacking the I into the story? Or do you start always, like, I saw this happen, why not just say what happened, as Robert Lowell would say?
Yeah, that's a great prompt. Just to add on to it, like the kind of a prompt of the multiplicity of voices. I'm thinking back to Langston Hughes and Let America Be America Again, and the kind of different voices that are in that poem. Might be an interesting
Or
prompt.
Montage
too.
of a Dream Deferred, I
Yeah.
think is the most American, I mean, it's one of the great American poems, I think, because it has these different voices.
Right, exactly. So write a poem tonight. You have homework.
Thanks.
Thanks.